Hello, I'm Mariette DiCristina, the Dean of the Boston University College of Communication. I'm also an alum of COM and the parent of a recent BU grad. Welcome to this afternoon's important COMtalks event. Disinformation and misinformation, how are those affecting society? This event is being recorded and will be available later on COM's website and on its YouTube channel. From hesitancy about taking life-saving vaccines to creating uncertainty around elections, misinformation and disinformation are taking a tremendous toll on societal well-being and even, perhaps, democracy itself. Today's panel brings an expert perspective on those impacts and also what can be done to limit the influence of disinformation and misinformation. When you have questions, please put them in that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen rather than in the chat. Don't use the chat. And please feel free to put the questions in there at any time during this conversation. And I promise there'll be plenty of time later to discuss them in this event. Now it's my genuine pleasure to introduce today's speakers. First, let's say hello to Brian McGrory, who is the chair of the journalism department, a professor of the practice in journalism, and a columnist for the Boston Globe, as well as the former editor of the Globe from 2013 until just this past January. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you, Mariette. Thank you for having me.
Thanks a million. Now let's say hello to Dr. Arunima Krishna, who is an assistant professor of public relations at Boston University College of Communication. She studies public perceptions of controversial social issues, including climate change, vaccine hesitancy, and workplace discrimination. Her latest project examines climate change misinformation and strategies to combat such misinformation. Hello there.
Thank you very much for having me.
So glad you're here, Arunima. Now let's welcome T. Barton Carter, who is professor of communication and specializes in communication law and new communication technologies. He received his BA from Yale University, his JD from the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and his MS in mass communication from Boston University. He's been on the faculty here at COM since 1977. So glad to have you here, Professor Carter.
Thanks, Mariette. Glad to be here.
And now I'm delighted to welcome our moderator. Anne Bailey Berman is the co-founder and former chair and CEO, Chadwick Martin Bailey. As CEO, she built the firm to one of the top 50 market research firms in the United States, serving a wide range of industries in the US and overseas. Prior to Chadwick Martin Bailey, she worked in cable television, the public sector, television news, and teaching at Louisiana State University and Boston University. She earned her BA and an MA from Louisiana State University and her MBA from Boston University. Welcome to you, Anne. Thanks so much for joining. Now I'll turn over the mic to you.
You know, as you said, we live in a time of we need to think things through. We live in a world where there's a lot of information, and this is really good for making certain decisions, having insights into various things. But there's so many more, and we've had misinformation for years, whether it be on speeches or, excuse me, Brian, the news. But what there has always been that. But now with technology, social media, there's even more. And the bad thing, one of the bad things, is that it is extremely dangerous for the American public. We now live where many lack trust in our information systems. People feel manipulated, lied to, taken advantage of. And so many people do not know who and what to believe. And so many people sincerely believe information that is not backed, but is really biased, wrong, and plain lies. So we only have an hour to discuss something that probably could take us weeks to really be able to discuss. So let's move on. Arunima, I'll start with you. When did misinformation become such an industry that it affects our national sense of trust?
That's a great question, Anne. And I can tell you from an academic perspective, we've been studying misinformation for a while. And it really started, or one of the things that we started looking at was misinformation that was in news media, where it was misinformation that was broadcast in the form of a journalistic story, but that something that the journalists truly believed to be true at the time. And so there was a lot of research on trying to understand how do we correct information that was incorrectly delivered in the first place. And what we found, or what researchers found, was that that misinformation or that piece of incorrect information has a really strong effect on people's perceptions, and corrections, no matter how many times you deliver them, may not be as effective. In the last 10 odd years, 10, 15 odd years, since we've seen the rise of social media, we've seen a rise in misinformation that is away from the journalistic perspective and in the social and digital atmosphere. And so that's where we've seen really misinformation being a big issue that affects society at large and individuals at a very deep level as well. And while we're talking about this, if I may just provide a definition of misinformation and differentiate it from disinformation. So misinformation refers to incorrect information that is delivered or disseminated without intention to deceive. Disinformation refers to misinformation or false information that is disseminated with malicious intent, with the intent to deceive. And so disinformation and misinformation are different in those ways, where disinformation is a subset almost of misinformation.
What is the range of misinformation or disinformation? Does it only happen in those political issues that we would already mentioned, such as vaccines, abortions, elections, or is misinformation broader? Does it go into healthcare? What is the range of misinformation?
Absolutely. So the range of misinformation is wide. And one of, as Mariette mentioned, one of the projects that I'm working on is on climate change, which, as you know, is a topic that has had very well-funded disinformation campaigns. And I'm very deliberate in saying disinformation campaigns against it. The oil and gas lobbies and their respective advertising and PR firms, and this pains me to say, I'm a PR professor, but their advertising and PR firms spent basically millions of dollars and used the tobacco lobby's playbook in trying to sort of cast a lot of doubt on climate science. And so there you have, of course, the climate change is a hoax, that sort of narrative as being part of the misinformation and disinformation environment around climate change. Now what we're seeing is a little bit more insidious disinformation from oil and gas companies. And that comes in the form of native advertising. And I'm sure Brian can talk about native advertising for days. And native advertising is essentially content or advertisements in legacy media, such as the New York Times, the Boston Globe, that is paid. It is paid advertising, but it is delivered to look like native content. It is delivered to look like it is an actual news story in the New York Times or in the Globe, and so on and so forth. In fact, the New York Times has an entire studio dedicated to creating such content. And what we've seen is that the oil and gas companies have spent quite a bit of their marketing budgets on spreading or at least seeding doubts about what their own work is related to climate change and spread disinformation in those ways.
What causes people who are the people that are most likely to believe in the false information that they get? Is there any patterns there?
Absolutely. So I can speak to my own research. So a few years ago, I developed a typology of disinformation susceptibility, which basically says about any specific topic, if you are motivated about a topic, if you hold extreme attitudes, pre-existing attitudes about the topic, and have already accepted some misinformation about a topic, you are most likely to accept additional misinformation about it. And more worryingly, you are more likely to spread and amplify additional misinformation about that topic and evangelize about that topic to others. And and sort of it's an exponential effect there.
Martin, and I've invited people to talk, and ask questions among y'all three. What can we do to minimize the effect of the misinformation or disinformation that we have, legally considering our constitutional rights of free speech? Is there anything that can be done?
Well, whatever you want to try and do is going to be very, very difficult. There are several barriers. First is a simple jurisdictional one, which is a lot of it comes from other countries. And therefore, our laws can't do anything. For example, we have a very strong law against spam, the, believe it or not, Canned Spam Act. And how much spam do you get? You see the problem. Second, there is a real problem with the Constitution and the First Amendment. And so the question is, what speech can you regulate, limit, prohibit, etc.? And the answer is a lot less than people think. There are certain categories you can prohibit, obscenity for one. But believe it or not, there are others that you might think could be limited and couldn't. There's a case that struck down a law prohibiting people from claiming military honors they didn't have. Disinformation even, not just misinformation. And it was struck down by the Supreme Court because they didn't see that this was doing enough harm to justify the government's intervention. In addition, under the First Amendment, you have to define exactly what it is you're trying to regulate. And if you can't, so that a reasonable person knows exactly what they can or cannot do, then is what we call void for vagueness, because it would tend to inhibit too much legitimate speech. Okay. We even have a very famous case, press law, Times v. Sullivan, that says that defamatory statements in some circumstances are protected. A public figure or public official has to prove they were uttered with knowledge of falsity or reckless disregard. So going back to Arunima's definitions, that might apply to disinformation, but probably not to most misinformation, because there's no knowledge of falsity. They may honestly believe it. And then the echo chamber, the social media, which have exacerbated the problem, amazing amount. There's a law called, or part of a law called Section 230, which basically says the social media companies are not responsible unless they create the message. So that, of course, could be fixed by Congress. But at the moment, everybody in Congress hates 230, but for very different reasons. One side wants the social media to censor more, to take back fake news, disinformation, and so on. Another whole group, however, feel that they're being censored too much, and they want to take away the right of social media to censor in any way. So solving that problem will be very hard for simple political reasons.
How can we renew trust? Do we need to in some way redefine what the freedom of speech really is? And I assume that's in Congress that has to be done.
No, actually, Congress can't redefine it. Congress is the one limited by the First Amendment. First Amendment starts off, Congress shall make no law. So it's how the court interprets the First Amendment. And that over time has changed. For example, at one point, advertising was not protected by the First Amendment, commercial speech, not at all, up until the late 70s, as a matter of fact. And they basically set out some narrow areas, obscenity, and so on. Otherwise, you have to go through an interpretation of, is it on balance worth having the speech restricted? And usually if it's content regulation, that means you have to meet strict scrutiny. Strict scrutiny means you have to have a compelling government interest, and it has to achieve this in the least restrictive means possible. That's a very, very hard test to meet. And as a result, I think a lot of regulation in this area will not be very successful.
Trust is very important in our country. If I'm hearing you right, I'm hearing that there is nothing we can do to be able to deal with misinformation, to gain that trust back. If I'm wrong, what is it that we should be able to do? How do we regain trust in the American public?
Oh boy, I think, first of all, I think if I had a real quick answer to that, I could retire tomorrow. But it's very difficult. I mean, I don't know how else to say it. You know, try and craft regulation probably only would be useful against disinformation than misinformation. A lot harder to regulate that because you now don't have the intent and so on, which is often part of criminal regulation. You have to define it perfectly. You have to justify it with a compelling government interest and point out that you're not going too far and regulating some speech that should be allowed. And even, I hate to say it, one of the problems is, okay, what is disinformation? It's false speech, right? Who defines truth? I mean, at different points in time, there have been scientific certainties that, oh, well, on second thought, not so far. Okay, so what happens if you decide this is a truth and nobody can challenge it, nobody can put out contrary information? We never find out that it was wrong. So that's another burden.
Brian, how has this affected misinformation and disinformation affect the news industry?
God, we need about 3 hours to talk about that. But could I just go back to your point, though, about restoring trust? And just to flip it back on you for a second, the question I would ask is, restoring trust in who and in what? What are we trying to trust? Is it the news media? Is it government institutions? I think a lot of the answer to that depends on where we are trying to restore trust. And the answer can get very fragmented from there. I mean, we could elect public officials who are simply more trustworthy, who don't lie 30,000 times over the course of a 4-year presidency, as the Washington Post pointed out. You know, there are a lot of things you could do to restore trust, but it all comes down to who are we trying to trust and why. But I'm sorry, I just went off on a question you didn't ask. Sorry.
Yeah, but I think that's an important aspect of this whole area.
So your question was, how has it affected the news media and the kind of legacy operations that Arunima was kind enough to attack at the top of the hour here? Just kidding. But look, our work in the news media, in journalism, becomes all the more important when we see the lack of trust that is going on throughout our society. And when we have politicians who are lying, when we have utterly absurd conspiracy theories that are being accepted as truth among a shocking number of people, then what we do at, an objective news organization becomes all the more important. We have to double down, triple down, do everything we possibly can to be as objective as we possibly can.
One of another college in the area put out a report that said that the news media probably is the biggest spreader of false information. That even when they know it's a lie, they still put it in the newspaper or talk about it on the radio, or or on social media. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think it comes down to how you define what the news media is. And, Barton mentioned earlier, but so many people exist in their own ideological bubbles. And they just hear what they want to hear, and their views are, reinforced and then accentuated by the places they decide to get their news from. And so that's problematic. I have a hard time, buying that, respected legacy news operations are the biggest purveyor of misinformation or disinformation. I think not only do I have a hard time buying it, I think it's absurd. But there is a notion involved there that we talk about a lot in my industry, and it's the whole construct of false parity. And that is, you cannot give, if somebody is just out and out lying, if they're, lying about vaccines causing deaths or the results of an election, you don't simply give them a platform and pretend that what they're saying is as viable as something that is objectively truthful. And I think that we have struggled as an industry a bit amid the onslaught of disinformation that we probably weren't fully prepared for to come to terms with that.
Is the news industry beginning to put its own regulations to box the misinformation out?
I mean, we don't, it's a good question. We don't really regulate in the, purest sense of the word, but we come to terms with. I mean, for a long time, there was a discussion that was never probably properly resolved over whether you describe Donald Trump's assertions as lies or not. And we probably spent too much of his presidency not describing them as lies and dancing around it a bit and being unnecessarily polite. I think regulation is a strong word. There's just more of an understanding of what's going on out there. I mean, look, go way back to Sandy Hook and what Alex Jones did after that. And many people would describe that as the giving real birth to disinformation in this era. I don't know that anybody who is in the kinds of institutions that we work in who were prepared for the number of people who would believe this stuff and the profiteering that could occur from it. And I think we're slow to catch up with it.
Okay. How does the whole settlement for Fox, how does that affect what can be done with mis and disinformation? Barton, do you have a thought about the whole?
Not a whole lot, because what happened with Fox is they actually went over the line of what's protected in the area of defamation. I said earlier, remember that public figures can still win if they can prove knowledge of falsity or reckless disregard. Well, there was a lot of evidence that, in fact, there was knowledge of falsity with what they were saying about the Dominion company and its machines. And when that all started to come out in discovery, a lot of us were sitting there going, this is actually a textbook case of what can still be regulated. But I don't think that other than that, it affects a whole lot. I don't know, Fox may pull back somewhat, but most people won't go that far of the line anyway. So it really doesn't change matters that much.
Is there a way that we can educate people and teach them to be able to look at the data that they're given to determine whether it's true or not? Is there anything we could do in schools or out of schools to teach people how to be able to make a good determination? I'm talking in the air.
Well, I don't know, as Brian said, an awful lot of people are in their own ideological bubbles, and it can even start with the family. So you don't know when you start thinking that. And then trying to correct it or teach them otherwise, it's very difficult.
Yeah.
I mean, it used to be when there was a real scarcity of media, you almost had to be exposed to different points of view because, there were 3 networks. There were just the newspapers, and a lot of cities only have 1, 2. And for those to be successful, they had to reach a wide range of people. So they couldn't take really sharp ideological viewpoints because it was costly to their business. Now, of course, we have the internet and unlimited number of outlets. And it's more trying to, from a financial standpoint, trying to attract a specific group and not worrying about everybody else. So a lot of people are no longer exposed to contrasting points of view. They are just reinforcing what they've been taught or what they believe.
AI-generated content. Someone wrote a question.
I'm not sure I heard the thrust of that question. Did you guys pick it up?
I believe the question is one from the chat. Let me read it out from the chat. It seems, or from the Q&A. Seems to me that AI-generated content is threatening truthful communication across all traditional and social media channels and will be a challenge to legitimate news sources. How should they prepare to meet this challenge?
I'm listening to the news media.
I'm going to paraphrase Barton from a little earlier. If I had a good answer to that one, which I don't, where, in the news industry, we are mostly struggling with some small sliver of hope of what AI might mean to what we do. We firmly believe, is a general rule, that it's not going to replace having, human hands, human eyes, human heart, human soul on reporting and writing. But we also, wonder if the use of AI could help with some pretty straightforward parts of a news report, as long as we don't let it get out of control. The reality is, and I'm more curious what you guys think, we're at a really early stage. We don't know what it means yet, and we're struggling with it, and I suspect that will go on for a while. So there's a lot of skepticism and a slight amount of hope, I think, from where I sit.
I think the key is.
Go ahead, Arunima.
Thank you. I think the key is to remember that AI, at the end of the day, is a tool and not the end product. And so either party or anyone across the world, whether it's journalists or people who are trying to deceive or anyone can use it. It's how it gets used is the key here. And something we're trying to figure out as educators is how do we equip our students to make the best use of it while retaining their own authentic voice and doing the best that they can for the world. Barton.
Well, I was going to say, from the legal perspective, it's a long, hard slog. Technology moves at light speed these days. The law moves at snail speed. There are a host of questions that AI has already raised. Can an AI own a copyright? On the other hand, is training an AI using data from other people's databases copyright infringement? What happens if you're defamed by AI? There's actually a case going on in Australia on that one, by the way, where AI answered a question, claimed that somebody had been committing a crime 20 years earlier, when in fact, he'd been the one who'd reported it. And so he's now trying to sue there. I mean, it's going to be very hard for the law to keep up in any way, shape, or form on this. Fascinating, but hard.
There's another question that points to that, and that is in the issue of disinformation. Is it being better managed by European and other overseas counterparts because they don't have the First Amendment right?
Well, they've got a new law going into effect, the Digital Services Act in the European Union, that makes the largest social media companies and so on responsible for disinformation on their sites. In this country, of course, those companies are private, which means they enjoy First Amendment protection. So, yes, I guess in one sense you could say clearly they may be doing a better job of controlling it. The question is at what cost? And that's where the whole balance is.
What else can we do? You're the experts.
The research has
I
shown
think the
that
pause says something.
Yep.
if we had a straightforward or a great answer to that one, I think all of us could retire and be rich. But so there are incremental steps we can take as long as the social media companies continue not to monitor or what have you. But so individual interactions have been shown to help on certain topics, and I can specifically speak to vaccines, for example. Vaccine misinformation, and I'm saying misinformation specifically on social media, tends to be spread in the form of these very powerful narratives. And we saw this particularly before the pandemic and during the pandemic as well, about how somebody got the vaccine and could not get up from got very, very sick and got very unwell and so on and so forth. With the MMR vaccine, there are these very heart-wrenching narratives that are spread on social media about how somebody's friend's child was a happy young kid, and then they got the MMR vaccine, and the next day they suddenly became autistic. We call this the overnight autism vaccine injury narrative. And these are very, very popular on Facebook because, and particularly Facebook, and of course also other social media, but especially on Facebook, on moms groups and so on and so forth, because they're heart-wrenching and they play into parents' fears about possible harm to their kids, which of course is a very serious thing. It's a very important decision for parents to make. And so something we've tested is trying to promote or trying to counter these kinds of stories with personal stories of pro-vaccine experiences. And so that's something that we found to be effective. Interpersonal communication between a healthcare provider and a vaccine hesitant parent have also been shown to be effective in helping reduce the misperceptions caused by these kinds of stories. So there are, depending on the topic that we're discussing, there are things that can be done. So it's not all hopeless.
Barton, Brian?
Barton, you want to go with that?
Go ahead.
The problem is, from my perspective, I'm talking about all the legal stuff. And as I said, you want to talk about how slowly something can move. I mean, you change the law in two basic ways: pass new laws, and we've seen how great Congress is these days on moving anything through, or court interpretations, which means you have to have a case first, and then it has to get through the courts to a certain level. And may get up, to get to the Supreme Court, you've got several years in the making. So you definitely don't have any quick fixes on that front at all.
I mean, I know, I think lawyers are the only people on the planet that make journalists look like optimists, but
you're right.
I just look, we just seem to be in, this may not answer your question, Ann, but we just seem to be in an unusual moment. And as I discuss sociology, I'm way out of my realm, but we're coming out of a global pandemic. People were separated. We all heard the Surgeon General report this week about the epidemic of loneliness, and social media is filling this void, and not in very good ways. And it's really opened us up to the combination of loneliness and ideological bubbles and social media of really propelling the whole idea of disinformation. And this is a tough one to overcome.
And fact of the matter is, and I apologize for not being optimistic here, but fact of the matter is that any work that we do to try to help reduce the epidemic or stop the epidemic, any strategies we suggest are also adopted by bad faith actors and very quickly, who tend to be very well funded and very motivated to act in bad faith. And so that's the uphill struggle that we're up against. And I see a question in the chat about something exactly related to that, not in the chat, in the Q&A, about how oil lobbyists posing at Save the Whale community groups trying to seed doubt about offshore wind. And that's exactly getting at what I am referring to. I do remember back in the day, about 10, 15 years ago, when Facebook was actually not the cesspool it is now, and they had content moderators that sort of checked for the news on the side, like actual human beings that did that, and then they did away with it, that program. And that's when disinformation, misinformation sort of bloomed on social media. So content moderation is an important tool, but again, financial pressures and other pressures, of course, take primary priority.
Yeah, and as I said before, they have the First Amendment protection, so it's not like you can force them to moderate content. One other problem with the law, I just briefly mention, is there are two parts of any case: facts, and then the law or judicial interpretation. The facts are determined at the trial level, the first level. The subsequent courts can say that the law was applied wrong, but they can't redo the facts. So unfortunately, as a case goes over a couple of years, the facts on which they're relying are no longer facts. An extreme example of this was something called the Communications Child Online Protection Act. It was an attempt to limit indecency on the internet. Started at the trial court, went to an appellate court, went to the Supreme Court. They sent it back to the appellate court. Appellate court had to decide again, then went back to the Supreme Court. We're talking about the internet. Now, during that whole time period, how much of the factual basis of the original decision was still valid? Almost none. And that's another problem with the speed of all of this.
Are there any experiments, I'm reading a question here, are there any experiments in helping courts adapt more quickly as technologies change? Not only facts change, but technology has definitely changed.
Not really. I mean, the problem is that the only thing you can really do is try and educate the judges as to what the technology is. And sometimes they will try and gather information, but you still have the basic pace of the court system. It may take a year or more to go to trial, may take a year or more for appeal. And then if you're going to go to the Supreme Court, still another year or more. And that's where the real problem is. Now, there have been proposals to let the appellate courts determine the facts or redetermine the facts, but they haven't gone very far. Those have mostly been scholarly, suggestions.
And there's also the question of, is it in the interests of not the judiciary necessarily, but in the interest of Congress, for example, or Congress people and people who run nations? Is it in their interests to regulate mis and disinformation? Because many of them profit from it, or at least not profit, I should not say that, benefit from it.
Oh, sure, and could say some engage in it.
Most definitely.
Right. Brian, here's a question for you. Daily newspaper circulation has fallen from 60 million to 25 million, according to Pew. How has this decline in legacy media and the emergence of new social media defined the communication landscape? Are we seeing the newspaper industry go?
It's a good question with a complicated set of answers, and there's no one universal answer for every news organization, every community, country. We're seeing really harsh news deserts develop all over America, including right here in Massachusetts and New England, even right around this area, where the kind of weekly news organizations that were telling you about community affairs basically no longer exist, or don't even have a reporter on their staff if they do. And that has been problematic. And some of that void has been filled in by Facebook groups and the like. A place like where I come from, the Globe, our circulation is actually higher now than it's been in the last close to 15 years. And that's representative of a change in reader habits more than a decline in mainstream news media. People are going online. Most of our subscribers now are online, not in print. Most of our readership is online, not in print. I don't see that as anything to worry about at all. I actually think that the immediacy of online journalism is a benefit to the communities that we're trying to serve, and meeting people where they want to be and when it's most relevant than meeting them once a day on a print paper that they're probably not reading. So I'm excited about that part. But look, the industry has been severely disrupted, and that's a very polite word for the business model has been completely annihilated. And many places are, trying to regroup and recover, not all of them successfully. And that opens the door all the further to disinformation.
One person just wrote, regarding earlier discussions about page stories intended to look like news. I've been led to believe that the New York Times is worth subscribing to support the expense of real journalism. Can I trust the New York Times? And if not, who can I trust?
Well, the Boston Globe.
I thought that might be your answer.
Yeah, but you can absolutely look. The New York Times sets a standard in U.S. journalism. I mean, it's a very, very good, reliable news organization. The Times, just addressing what came up earlier about native advertising, it's a very valid point that Arunima raised. And I think a broader context is necessary. Again, the business models for news organizations, specifically newspapers, it completely collapsed. The advertising market was dropping at a pace of over 20% a year for many, many years. Print circulation was falling really rapidly because of changing reader habits. So as news organizations were trying to regroup and get funding for the journalism that is vitally important, many, to varying degrees, have tested the whole concept of native advertising. The key to that, if done right, if done well, is to make sure that it's entirely discernible online, is not journalism, to not trick people thinking that it is journalism, and to make sure that a newsroom can maintain its values even as they produce native advertising, even as other parts of the organization produce native advertising. It's tricky. I'm not going to sit here and say I love it. I don't. But what I don't want is to draw bright lines in which this can't be done, and we further decimate already shrinking newsrooms.
And so one of the ways that most organizations will differentiate between native ads and real journalistic content is that it will have a disclaimer that says paid post or sponsored post or what have you. Now, the problem is that there is no standardized way in which folks can or different news organizations do this. And sometimes when somebody shares a link of a paid post on a social media platform, that declaration, that disclosure disappears. And it's not consistent across different news media, which of course can be a little bit muddy. So if I may, Anne, Barton, is that something that that can be regulated, or is that also protected under the First Amendment? How native advertising is labeled and disclosed on social media and on websites?
Well, that would, again, obviously have to raise a serious First Amendment question. Now, in broadcasting, we did have rules for that, and sponsor ID and all kinds of things along those lines. And the FTC has some for advertising. For example, if you're being paid to say something, you have to disclose it. But whether you could actually force a standardized statement as to what something was, and then force people to always link it so that it goes whenever they resend it, that might raise a lot more serious question.
Another question about the First Amendment came up. Would it make sense to adapt the US free speech model to a European German version where some form of disinformation, such as denying the Holocaust, can land you in jail or on a domestic terrorist list? Is this something we're considering?
This is a trade-off. And essentially, the more you can prohibit speech and different categories, et cetera, the more the majority in the government can control things. One thing you have to say about the First Amendment is an anti-majoritarian amendment in many ways. It means because the majority, generally, you're not going to have to regulate that much anyway, because they're the people who are electing you. But the minorities are the, dissents and the less popular are more likely to have their speech limited. I mean, Times v. Sullivan, among other things, was all about people in the South weaponizing defamation against those opposing segregation. I mean, the ad in question was protesting segregation, and somebody, like county commissioner down there, claimed it defamed him, and in a state court got a judgment of, I think it was $500,000, which back in the 60s was actually real money. And you imagine what effect that would have on speech in general. And that was the genesis of the Sullivan Rule and all the current rules in defamation. So this is the problem. The more you let the government determine what speech is allowed, the more you take the risk that they will skew it, that they will penalize unpopular speech.
Speaking of the South, so much of the South is rural. They don't have newspapers. They're not getting the New York Times. They're not fortunate enough to get the Boston Globe. And so their only news is on social media. And what is the station that's watched the most frequently? Fox. And so how do we deal with that? Newspapers tend to be more local, other than the New York Times and the Washington Post. But how can we deal with the lack of information of that people have about not getting multiple sources of information that can allow them to then make decisions about truth? Is there an answer?
Wish there was. I really wish there was. I mean, look, in my industry, the answer is being increasingly rooted in the whole notion of philanthropic driven journalism. And if commercial models don't work, then, we rely on the the good deeds of significant philanthropies who are willing to fund news organizations so that there can be a reporter in a given community that can have, objective reporting in news. But there is a massive fund that's being put together. I think it's about a $500 million fund that's in the process of getting collected by a group of big ticket philanthropies launching projects just like this. Whether that ultimately is big enough, good enough, strong enough to address what you're talking about, I honestly don't know.
Yeah.
One thing is some other countries, Europe, and then of course, Australia, so on, have taken the position against news aggregators, saying that they need to pay for their content when they take the news from somewhere else. And the idea is to support the local news media. The Australian one was directly designed to that. And they have actually started to pay Facebook and Google, a number of these news organizations. So that might be part of an answer.
What about things like NewsGuard? It's a for-profit company which offers misinformation risk audits of news organizations and sites. Is that something?
I mean, I'm vaguely familiar with them. I think they did an audit of the Globe at one point a couple of years ago. I'm not, I don't by any measure criticize what they're doing. I'm not sure that it ultimately translates to our readers in a meaningful way.
I also would say that the question would be, how are they defining it? And do they have any agendas? I mean, are they that trustworthy? And I'm not casting aspersions against that particular company. I have no idea. But I'm just saying anybody who purports to be doing that raises those questions.
As I think about how people can determine what's truthful or not, they need multiple sites, multiple ways of getting information so they can make judgment calls or they can hear different views. And right now, we're not in a world where people, the majority of people in this country can get that. Am I so caught up being on the East Coast that I don't really realize that there are more different sites?
Well, I'd say on the internet now, they can have access to all different points of view. The problem is they don't want to. They want to only go to ones that reinforce what they believe. But it's not due to lack of possible alternatives. You can go on the internet and you can see everything from Fox News to MSNBC, et cetera, right off the bat. But when they only want to hear what they want to hear, so to speak, that's where the real problem is.
One comment that's come through is many people who watched Fox before the Dominion lawsuit still say they still watch the channel and don't believe or don't care that Fox lied to and want to seek and lied to them and want to seek sources that don't always tell them what they want to hear. Brian, I think that follows some of what you said about it depends on what their view is, and then they watch that particular type of site.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me go back to something that Barton said a little earlier that surprised me. And if I heard it right, it was that you didn't think that the Dominion settlement was going to have much of an impact. And I don't know. That's $750 million. Tucker Carlson got fired within days. Their most popular primetime host. There's another, what is it, the Smartmatic case or whatever the company
there's
called,
another one
still coming down the pike. I can't help but think that's a bit of a warning shot to news organizations who were getting really loose with propelling disinformation, but maybe I'm being too optimistic about that.
I guess I'd say two things. It may cause them to pull back somewhat, but it may also cause them to be a little more careful what they text to each other and do a better job of not leaving a huge trail.
The other thing Fox does really well also that is worth mentioning is the weaponization of their opinion and their sort of talking heads who are not necessarily journalists and don't pretend to be journalists, but still are on Fox News and therefore are shrouded in, have some of the sheen of journalistic integrity. And so I'm sure Fox News does some journalism that has integrity, but then you have all of these experts and pundits who are not necessarily journalists but are on Fox News and have that platform, and so you have that differentiation yet not, which also is very effective, that Fox uses very effectively.
To move beyond Fox just for one moment, many people who watched Fox, oh sorry, I missed it, that they're in Twitter, that NPR is being reassigned on Twitter, and that there is a belief that, here it is, Elon Musk has told NPR he will reassign NPR to someone else if they don't start tweeting, which is one more sign of Twitter's meltdown. What is the possibility of a new platform coming along to take the place Twitter once held as a vital news source? Are we looking for another platform?
I guess the problem is to start up another platform. It only is effective if a lot of people are using it. It's sort of a critical mass type of operation. And I know there are a couple that have attempted to go into that particular sphere, but it's not clear that anybody else is going to be as successful.
Twitter, what do we think of Twitter as a viable information source?
I don't use it as a news source. Frankly, I use it only for sports. So
do I.
So I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, a lot of people do see it as a news source, but
yeah. Here's another question. As a pre-internet undergrad comm student, we learned so much about how to pick up the red flags of questionable news sources. Would it be helpful if that sort of content were woven into a wider set of national curriculum? Or would that just put the bad actors, how to teach the bad actors how to make themselves look more compelling?
I think we're right on the 4 o'clock mark, so I think we're almost out of time. So I will just say that we as a college are trying our best to adapt our curriculum to make sure that our students have enough critical thinking skills, that they'll be able to see and view content and make a well-informed judgment about how authentic it is and so on. Brian and Barton?
Yeah, I mean, we're you know, it's a much different age, obviously, right now than when that question asker was at COM pre-internet. I mean, there's a lot coming at everybody at any given moment. We're drenched in media, even as we always feel thirsty for reliable media. So it's a good idea to build that into our curriculum. I don't have a clear answer how yet.
no, I mean, obviously, you know, in the college communication, we have experts on this type of thing to be able to weave it in properly. But if you're talking about across high schools or across universities in general in all disciplines, that's an awful lot to try and implement.
The last is not a question, it's a statement, and I think we're out of time. I don't think people check multiple sources anymore. I feel like a dinosaur. It sounds like a student doing that. Thank y'all very much. I think we could be here for hours. talking about different aspects of the problem that we're facing as a country. I think we have to end. We may try to approach it in another way in the future. Want to thank people for being here and watching. There is a tape that you can also access, and thank you very much.
Thank you.